For more than 200 years, the district has been fighting for equal rights. Despite 86% of its residents voting for statehood in 2016, Congress has still not acted to ensure that the district shares in the blessings of liberty promised by the founders in the U.S. Constitution. The United States is a republic, but the people of its capital lack representation. The United States is the only democratic country that denies both voting rights in the national legislature and local self-government to the people of its capital. That is wrong and violates everything we stand for as Americans. The district pays more in federal taxes than 21 states and more per capita than any state. Think about that. It pays more than nearly half the states in this country. Yet D.C. residents have no vote in Congress. That is wrong. Unfortunately, so far, Republicans have opposed our efforts to ensure equality for district residents. But let me be clear what Republican opposition is really about: partisanship. They would rather deny voting rights for hundreds of thousands of American citizens than even consider the possibility that representatives from the new state could possibly be Democrats. Think about that argument. They're willing to violate the core principles of our democracy merely because the new state might elect representatives from a different political party. I strongly urge every member in this House to vote yes on H.R. 51, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from New York, Ms. Maloney reserves. Gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Comer, is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. America's federal government should be of the people, by the people, and for the people. But with H.R. 51, America's government will become of the Democrats, by the Democrats, and for the Democrats. Let's be clear what H.R. 51 is all about. It's about Democrats adding 2 new progressive U.S. senators to push a radical agenda championed by the Squad to reshape America into the socialist utopia they always talk about. If you doubt me, just listen to what our colleague, Congressman Jamie Raskin, recently told the Washington Post. He said, and I quote, "There's a national political logic for D.C. statehood, too, because the Senate has become the principal obstacle to social progress across a whole range of issues," unquote. So there we have it. H.R. 51 is not really about voting representation. It's about Democrats consolidating their power in Washington. There are numerous problems with H.R. 51. Mainly, it's flatly unconstitutional. Every Justice Department, from President Kennedy's to President Obama's, has been consistent that a constitutional amendment is needed to grant the district statehood. Robert F. Kennedy said granting D.C. statehood without a constitutional amendment was inconceivable. He also said granting D.C. statehood as attempted by H.R. 51 would produce an absurdity. This absurdity is the 23rd Amendment, which acknowledges the existence of a federal district warranting 3 electoral college votes. While H.R. 51 includes an expedited process for the 23rd Amendment's repeal in Congress, the problem is this would not happen until after D.C. becomes a state. This would create mass confusion as H.R. 51 was reviewed by the courts for years. The Constitution is the foundational document upon which all the laws of our country rest, and Congress cannot simply dismiss it with sham legislation. But that's what H.R. 51 attempts to do. Democrats want to rewrite the Constitution without going through the proper process of doing so. During our committee's markup of H.R. 51, I offered an amendment that would assure the 23rd Amendment's repeal prior to statehood being granted, but Democrats opposed this amendment. Why are Democrats pushing such a problematic bill through the House? Why are they working so hard to advance D.C. statehood instead of pursuing a constitutional amendment that would engage the entire country through a process intended by our founding fathers? Because they know Americans have firmly rejected D.C. statehood. I urge my colleagues to vote with the vast majority of Americans and reject this unconstitutional and impractical bill. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Kentucky reserves. The gentlewoman from New York is recognized.
I now yield 5 minutes to the gentlelady from the District of Columbia, the author of this bill and moment in history, the great Eleanor Holmes Norton. 5 minutes.
Gentlewoman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my good friend, the gentle lady, for her leadership on this D.C. statehood bill. Congress has both the moral obligation and the constitutional authority to pass H.R. 51. This country was founded on the principles of no taxation without representation and consent of the governed. But D.C. residents are taxed without representation and cannot consent to the laws under which they, as American citizens, must live. The state of Washington, D.C. would consist of 66 of the 68 miles of the present-day federal district. The federal district would be 2 square miles, and Congress would retain plenary authority over it. H.R. 51 complies with the Constitution, including the Admissions Clause, the District Clause, and the 23rd Amendment. The Admissions Clause gives Congress the authority to admit new states. All 37 new states were admitted by Congress. No state was admitted by constitutional amendment, and no state would have to consent to the admission of the state of Washington, D.C. The District Clause gives Congress plenary authority over the federal district and establishes a maximum size of the federal district, 100 square miles. It does not establish a minimum size or a location of the federal district. Congress reduced the size of the federal district by 30% in 1846. The 23rd Amendment allows the federal district to participate in the Electoral College. H.R. 51 repeals the Enabling Act for the 23rd Amendment, and the 23rd Amendment itself would be quickly repealed. In any event, the 23rd Amendment does not establish a minimum size or location of the federal district. The Constitution does not establish any prerequisites for new states, but Congress generally has considered 3: population and resources, support for statehood, and commitment to democracy. The state of Washington, D.C. would meet each. D.C.'s population of 712,000 is larger than that of 2 states. D.C. pays more federal taxes per capita than any state and pays more federal taxes than 21 states of the Union. D.C.'s gross domestic product is larger than 17 states. In 2016, 86% of D.C. residents voted for statehood. D.C. residents have been petitioning for voting representation in Congress and local autonomy for 220 years. Congress has a choice. It can continue to exclude D.C. residents from the democratic process, forcing them to watch from the sidelines as Congress votes on federal and D.C. laws, and to treat them, in the words of Frederick Douglass, as aliens, not citizens, but subjects, end quote. Or it can live up to our nation's founding principles. Join the 54% of Americans, that is 54%, Mr. Speaker, and growing, who support D.C. statehood, and pass H.R. 51. I yield back.
Gentleman from the district yields back. Gentlewoman from New York reserves. Gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the Republican leader of the Government Operations Subcommittee from Georgia, Mr. Heiss.
Gentleman from Georgia is recognized for 1 minute.
I thank the ranking member. I don't even know where to begin to respond to what we just heard. To imply that Washington, D.C. has no representation is absolutely false. It does have local representation, also has a delegate right here in the House of Representatives, and has electoral votes for the president's elections, things that no other city in this country has. This H.R. 51 flies in the face of what our founders intended. They never wanted the seat of our government to be a state, and they specifically framed the Constitution to say so. And yet what the Democrats really are trying to do, that they will not admit, is gain even more representation by creating a city-state whereby they get 2 more senators. Again, this is absolutely against what our Constitution and our founders intended, and this ought to be soundly rejected, permanently rejected. And with that, I yield back. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Kentucky reserves. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, in this historic moment, I now yield 1 minute to this distinguished gentlewoman from California, the first female speaker in history, and our Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi.
Gentlewoman from California is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the gentlewoman, Madam Chair, for yielding and salute her for her leadership in bringing this historic legislation to the floor. All of us join in saluting Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton, who has been the patron saint of D.C. statehood since she came to Congress. She has been tireless, persistent, and dissatisfied. She has built historic support for this bill, which passed in the previous Congress with 235 votes. I rise as Speaker of the House to join my colleagues on this momentous day for American democracy as we right an historic injustice by passing legislation to finally grant Washington, D.C. statehood. Statehood for the District of Columbia is about showing respect for our democracy, for the American people, and for our Constitution. That Constitution begins with our preamble, "We the people," setting out our founders' vision of a government of, by, and for the people. Yet for more than 2 centuries, the people of Washington, D.C. have been denied their right to fully participate in our and their democracy. D.C., as the gentlewoman mentioned, Congresswoman Norton mentioned, pays more federal taxes per capita than any other state. Its budget is larger than 12 states. Its population is larger than 2 states. Its people have fought in every American war since the Revolution. D.C. residents have been fighting for voting rights and autonomy for 220 years, with a full 86% recently voting for statehood. And it is well past the time to grant them the rights that they have been fighting for and that they deserve. As I said, Mr. Speaker, I rise as Speaker of the House on this momentous occasion, but it is an official honor to do so, but it is also a personal privilege to join Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton, the distinguished chair of the Committee of Jurisdiction, Congresswoman Maloney, and others of my colleagues, our distinguished Majority Leader, Mr. Hoyer, who has made this part of his life's work in the Congress. So to join in this fight for statehood. But it's, as I say, a personal privilege because when I was born, my father was a member of Congress from Baltimore, Maryland, Thomas D'Alessandro Jr. He served as chairman of the District of Columbia Appropriations Subcommittee. That position made him the unofficial mayor of Washington because of the authority that the committee had over the District of Columbia and their every decision. However, my father did not agree with that. He was a proponent for what was then called home rule. So I often say that statehood for the District of Columbia is in my DNA. They went from home rule, then finally having a mayor, and now we want statehood. There is not, and we've always wanted statehood, but now we finally are able to pass it in the Congress. There's nothing theoretical or abstract about statehood. For example, last summer, the country watched in horror as federal agents and out-of-state National Guard troops were deployed against peaceful protesters in the district without residents' approval. And then, on January 6th, as our Capitol was being defiled and our Capitol Police assaulted and killed, and our members and staff terrorized, D.C. leaders did not have the authority to call in the National Guard to protect its people. Granting D.C. statehood means ensuring that its leaders have the tools they need to keep people safe. The governor of any one of our states has the authority to call in the National Guard. That is not an authority that is afforded to the mayor of Washington, D.C. If that were the case, we would have had protection much sooner. Statehood is also a matter of civil rights. The residents of the district have a right to self-governance and control over their lives and futures. And it's particularly meaningful that we passed this legislation just days after the anniversary of President Abraham Lincoln signing the District of Columbia Compensation Emancipation Act, freeing enslaved people in the district. Today, by passing H.R. 51, to admit the state of Washington Douglas Commonwealth to the Union, the House will finally address this unjust, unequal, and undemocratic situation. We look forward to a swift vote in the Senate on this essential legislation so that we can send this important legislation to the President's desk. At the same time, House Democrats will continue our work to protect every American's right to be heard at the ballot box. With that, I urge a strong vote for D.C. statehood, 51, and H.R. 51 today, easy to remember, and for its citizens' civil liberties, security, and the right to have a say in our democracy. And as I yield back, I once again want to commend Representative Eleanor Holmes Norton for her long dedication to justice for every person in our country, starting with the people she represents in the District of Columbia, hopefully soon to be the 51st state of the Union. With that, I urge that I vote and yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman from California yields back. Gentlewoman from New York reserves. Gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Biggs.
Gentleman from Arizona is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Let me tell you what Democrat support is really about of H.R. 51. Democratic partisanship, Democrat power, Democrat policy, Democratic progressive issues. No state has been admitted by the Constitution, but no state was created from a territory which was crafted in the Constitution. That's what you want to obviate. Even our founders understood very clearly, as they iterated in Federalist 43, quote, the indispensable necessity of complete authority at the seat of government carries its own evidence with it. It is a power exercised by every legislature of the Union, I might say of the world, by virtue of its general supremacy. Without it, not only the public authority might be insulted and its proceedings interrupted with impunity, but a dependence of the members of the general government on the state comprehending the seat of government for protection and the exercise of their duty might bring on the national councils an imputation of awe or influence. That is what is at stake here. H.R. 51 is bad according to the founders, but it also violates the 23rd Amendment. That is clear as well. And it's time that the Democrats realize it and quit trying this power grab and vote this thing down. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Kentucky reserves. Gentlewoman from New York is recognized.
I now yield 3 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from Virginia and chairman of the Government Operations Subcommittee, Jerry Conley.
Gentleman from Virginia is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my good friend, the distinguished chairwoman of our full committee, and my good friend Eleanor Holmes Norton, the Congresswoman from the District of Columbia, who soon, I hope, will have the right to vote on the floor of the House. Today, Mr. Speaker, we come together to right a wrong. 750,000 fellow Americans are denied the right to representation in their Congress, in the very place in which Congress is located, ironically. The only capital in the democratic world that denies its own citizens the right to vote and be represented. We've heard a lot of subterfuge here today, and we'll hear more about the Constitution. The Constitution that clearly gives Congress the right of admission of a state. Mr. Comer comes from Kentucky. Kentucky was composed of territory claimed by my state, Virginia. And they were a bunch of Whigs. We didn't object. And Congress, not a constitutional amendment, admitted Kentucky into the Union. And they elected Whigs, if you can think about that, Mr. Speaker. But we didn't make how you might vote a condition. But we do in this case. And I got to say, there's a lot of smokescreen to cloak what's really at stake here. When some say this is not about race or partisanship, you can be sure it's about race and partisanship. A city with a majority population that apparently might vote in a different way from some. So what? How somebody votes cannot be a test of whether they have the right to vote in a democracy. Will we right this wrong today? Will we rise above our petty partisan perspectives and fears and empower and enfranchise people who are fellow citizens simply because of their race or their party identification or their geographic location? That is not the America I know and love. It's gone on too long. When the Constitution was written, this place didn't exist. Nor did the founders and the writers of the Constitution know that it would. The first capital was New York. The second capital was Philadelphia. And there was a lot of back and forth about where would it finally be. It ended up here. Let's right this wrong after 200 years and give our fellow Americans voting representation here in the United States Congress by granting statehood. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentlewoman from New York reserves. Gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, if this bill's about race, I wonder why your majority leader, Steny Hoyer, voted against this very bill in 1993.
Yeah.
But with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Jordan.
Gentleman from Ohio is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Speaker, Democrats started last week with one of their members saying we should get rid of the police altogether. They ended last week with another one of their members being admonished by the trial judge in Minneapolis for saying ridiculous things. And what they do in between, they pass this bill out of committee, which gives 2 new Democrat senators to the District of Columbia. And less than 24 hours after that bill passed in committee, they introduced legislation to pack the Supreme Court. In 3 months of Democrats being in control of the federal government, they have increased the debt by $2 trillion. They created a crisis on the southern border, and they continue their push to defund the police. And now, so they can continue their radical policies, think about what else they've passed out of this body. A bill to federalize our voting laws, federalize our election laws, a bill to pack the court, as I said. They introduced that. The chairman of the Judiciary Committee, of all people, introduced that bill. And here we are today, pure power grab to give 2 Democrat senators to District of Columbia. There is a crisis on our southern border. The American people want us to focus on the crisis. Even the president called it a crisis. Let's stop the power grab. Let's deal with the issues the American people want us to deal with. That's what we should be focused on. I hope we vote this bill down. I urge a no vote and yield back to the gentleman from Kentucky.
Gentleman from Ohio yields back. Gentleman from Kentucky reserves. Gentlewoman from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to clarify that this should be a bipartisan issue. Republicans used to support voting representation in Congress for D.C. residents. Then President Eisenhower called for equal political rights for D.C. residents in 3 State of the Union addresses. Then President Nixon said, and I quote, "It should offend the democratic senses of this nation that D.C. residents do not have voting representation in Congress." In 2007, then Representative Mike Pence said on the floor, and I quote, "The fact that more than 500,000 Americans living in the District of Columbia are denied a single voting representative in Congress is clearly a historic wrong." With that, I now yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Maryland and chairman of the Civil Rights and Civil Liberties Subcommittee, Jamie Raskin.
Gentleman from Maryland is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Madam Chair. The consent of the governed. No taxation without representation. No conscription without representation. A Republican form of government for American citizens. All of our most essential democratic principles underwrite the trajectory of American political development, which has been the admission of 37 new states since the original 13 launched the Union. All of these states were admitted by one mechanism and one mechanism only, an act of Congress, exercising congressional power under Article 4, Section 3 to admit new states. There has never been a new state admitted by constitutional amendment. There has never been a state admission struck down by the United States Supreme Court, because the admission of new states is a political question in the juridical sense, which means it is vested exclusively in Congress to decide whether or not to admit new states. It is an exercise of the plenary power and judgment of the Congress, the people's branch. It is up to Congress to act. The opponents of democracy for 712,000 tax-paying, draftable American citizens right here in Washington, D.C., have now focused on the 23rd Amendment as the basis of their opposition. But the 23rd Amendment is no obstacle in any way. The purpose of the 23rd Amendment was to make sure that the local population got to participate in presidential elections. The admission of the new state vindicates that constitutional purpose. H.R. 51 itself would immediately repeal the federal statute that organizes the Electoral College for the District of Columbia, taking care of the problem that our friends are concerned about. So why don't they support H.R. 51? Well, the floor leader gave the game away when he said for him this was all about 2 new progressive liberal Democrat senators. It's all about 2 new liberal Democrat senators. They don't see taxation without representation. They don't see military service without representation, when tens of thousands of people from the nation's capital have served America in every war that we've ever had, going back to the Revolutionary War. They don't see governance without representation, without the consent of the governed. All that they see is 2 new liberal Democrat senators. But that cuts against everything that we believe in about American democracy. We do not deny people the right to vote based on our expectation of how they will vote. We don't disenfranchise people because we disagree with who they might elect. I would defend with my life the right of the people of Kentucky and Arizona to send my friends here, even to represent them, even though I disagree with most of what they stand for, including their rejection of the rights of people from Washington, D.C. And I would never disenfranchise them just because of that. The people of Washington...
Gentleman's time has expired.
30 seconds.
I yield the gentleman additional 30 seconds.
The people of Washington came to our aid on January 6th. When we were being attacked by violent fascist insurrectionists in this body, in this chamber, in this Congress, they came to our aid. They sent hundreds of Capitol officers and National Guardsmen to defend us. The people of Washington defend our democratic rights. Will we defend theirs? That's the question of H.R. 51. Let's pass statehood for the people of Washington.
Gentleman from Maryland yields back. Gentleman from New York reserves. Gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Roy.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized for 1 minute.
I thank the Speaker. I thank the gentleman from Kentucky. My friend from Maryland makes an excellent closing case in court because he knows that this is going to be in court, because he knows that this is constitutionally infirm. And he's trying to make the case that's going to have to be made in court on the losing side of the argument, because it is very clearly unconstitutional to add D.C. as a state by statute. And what we have here today is a simple question. Does anybody in this room believe that if Lubbock, Texas, had been set up as the capital seat of the United States of America, that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle would be arguing to give it the position of statehood? No, of course not. This city was set up by the founders to be the capital seat of the United States of America. It was not set up to be a state. And when my friend said that every other state has been added by statute, none of those had been specifically set up as the capital seat of the United States of America. This should be rejected. It is unconstitutional. D.C. has never been a state. It shouldn't be a state, and it's not going to be a state.
Gentleman yields back.
Reserve.
Gentleman from Kentucky reserves. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
I now yield 2 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from Illinois, Congressman Danny Davis.
Gentleman from Illinois is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and let me thank you for yielding to me. And also, I want to commend you, Chairman Maloney, on your outstanding leadership of this committee. I also want to take a moment and commend my colleague who has been championing D.C. statehood before I even came to Congress. You know, I've listened intently to all of the arguments, and it always gets back to one. How are the people in D.C. more likely to vote? And they're going to vote more likely Democratic. Are they going to vote for Democrats? Well, let me tell you, I got people in my district who vote Republican. Can you imagine that? They vote Republican. But we don't deny them the right to vote. And we don't deny them the right to representation. All that we're seeking and all that we're asking for is simply the principle that no taxation without representation. I think we learned that in grammar school when we took U.S. history, when we first learned how great this country is and how great it can be. Well, I look forward to the people of Washington, D.C. having all rights of citizenship as a member of a state, voting in the greatest state in the country when it becomes one, Washington, D.C. Thank you, Madam Chairman, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from New York reserves. Gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Keller.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In 1964, then Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy summed it up best as to why the framers put the capital outside the borders or control of any state. It was indispensably necessary, this is his quote, it was indispensably necessary to the independence and the very existence of the new federal government to have a seat of government which was not subject to the jurisdiction or control of any state. As true as that was when this was said, as true as that was when our nation, when the capital was moved here, it's that true today. And my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, I'm glad, remember history, when the seat of the federal government was in New York City and in Philadelphia, the birthplace of America. They didn't want it in the control of a state. Therefore, the District of Columbia was created. The District of Columbia under the control of the United States Congress, because that is who should be determining what happens for the 50 states. Our colleagues on the other side want to change an amendment to the Constitution with law. What about other amendments to the Constitution and how they read those? Will they try to change those with with law.
Time has
This is
expired.
not about representation without taxation or taxation without representation. This is about a Democrat power grab. And let's call it what it is.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Reserved.
Gentleman from Kentucky reserves. Gentlewoman from New York is recognized.
I now yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentlelady from Texas, Congresswoman Jackson Lee.
Gentlewoman from Texas is recognized for 1 minute.
I thank the distinguished chairwoman, and I thank the distinguished member, Congresswoman from the District of Columbia. In the Judiciary Committee right now, we are holding hearings to fight against the scourge of voter suppression and the unfortunate abolishment of Section 5 by the Shelby case. I have heard shoutings of hallelujah when that case was abolished. The reason is because we are here today denying citizens of the United States the right to be represented fairly in the United States Congress. The 23rd Amendment, well, I can cite for you the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment, not depriving people of their liberty and their justice. What about those soldiers who shed blood from the District of Columbia, those who are paying taxes from the District of Columbia, but the very citizens who work to move the engine of government living in the District of Columbia? My friends know that the capital will be separated. My friends understand that there is a basic constitutional unfairness when you deny people the right to vote. And I wonder whether or not the problem is that when I first arrived here many years ago, it was called Chocolate City. Let us not make this a racial issue. Let us make this a justice issue, a constitutional issue. It is important, Mr. Speaker. Vote for this legislation for the 51st state. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentlewoman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Grothman.
Gentleman from Wisconsin is recognized for 1 minute.
D.C. statehood is a ridiculous idea which should have shocked our forefathers. It's a government city. No or minimal manufacturing, agriculture, or natural resources. With all its government jobs and universities, it's a recession-proof city and should be one of the easiest cities in the nation to govern. Let's see how the current elected officials are doing. This is the second highest spending area in the country per pupil. How do they do? Tied for worst of fourth grade reading scores. Worst in the country in eighth grade reading scores. Worst in the country fourth grade writing scores. Worst in the country eighth grade writing scores. Second worst in the country in eighth grade math. They have more homeless here than 29 states. Of the cities with at least 600,000 people, they have the sixth highest murder rate. And if they were to become a state, it would immediately be the state with the highest murder rate in the country. Right now, by comparison, only 49% of the parents' newborn children in the District of Columbia are married. By comparison, again, a great foreign capital, Taipei, 96% of the parents are married. This is a government city, and it would do a horrible job as a state.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Kentucky reserves. The gentlewoman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, under the admissions clause of the Constitution, Congress has the authority to admit new states. And that's why all 37 new states have been admitted by simple legislation. No state has ever been admitted by a constitutional amendment. And the Republicans want D.C. to use an admissions process that has never been used in the history of this country. The District Clause of the Constitution gives Congress authority over the federal district and establishes a maximum size of the federal district, 100 square miles. It does not establish a minimum size. H.R. 51 would maintain a 2 square mile federal district. And with that, I reserve and yield back.
Gentlewoman reserves.
Yeah.
From New York. Gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from South Carolina, Ms. Mace.
Gentlewoman from South Carolina is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've seen more damage done in the first 100 days of this administration than I thought possible in 4 years. Rather than unity, it's been division. Rather than working together, it's been partisanship. And we're hearing even today in the comments that we're trying to stoke racial division in this country. This is nothing but a naked power play today. That's all this is about. People who can't get their radical agenda passed under the system our framers set up now want to blow it up. This is nothing but ideological terrorism by those willing to completely ignore our Constitution and system of government. Whether it's attacks on the First, Second, or Fourth Amendment or turning our federal seat of government over to two more far-left senators, they simply do not care. They want what they want. This is not about a balance of power. This is about more power. This is about government-run healthcare, a $93 trillion Green New Deal, packing the Supreme Court, higher taxes, and a bigger, less efficient form of government. I yield back.
Gentlewoman from South Carolina yields back. Gentleman from Kentucky reserves. Gentlewoman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from Illinois and Senior Chief Deputy Whip, Congresswoman Sharkowski.
Gentlewoman from Illinois is recognized for 1 minute.
I rise in strong support of ending the disenfranchisement of over 700,000 people, including most of the staff that works for us every single day. Our nation is the only democratic country in the world that denies full democratic rights to the citizens living in its nation's capital. That's more than 700,000 American citizens who pay federal taxes, who fight and die in wars, who serve on our juries, and yet have no vote in the Senate or the House of Representatives. That is the definition of taxation without representation. It is 219 years overdue for the citizens of the District of Columbia to have their right to vote. Let me thank and commend my colleague Eleanor Holmes Norton for all of her decades of work. It is time to vote yes on statehood for the District of Columbia. And I yield back.
Gentlewoman from Illinois yields back. Gentlewoman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Fallon.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Making D.C. a city-state is unconstitutional, it's impractical, and it flies in the face of the founders' intent. James Madison said it himself in the Federalist Papers. Unfortunately, our colleagues across the aisle are trying to make this about race. I thought that was inevitable, and it's sad and unfortunate. But let's look at data. In 1800, this city was a white majority, 10,600 and 4,000 African-American residents. Then 150 years later, in 1950, 517,000 white residents to 280,000 African-American residents. So for 150 years, this was a white majority city, and there was no serious effort to make it a state. But there is a way we can solve this issue, because one core argument is a pretty good one. No taxation without representation. It's flawed because there is local government, and they have a delegate here. But with retrocession, making Washington and bringing it back into Maryland would give them that added seat and would address that very issue. And the GOP is acting in good faith because we know that that seat will be a Democratic seat, but it's the right thing to do. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Kentucky reserves. The gentlewoman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to a champion for equality and the 51st state, to the distinguished gentleman from Maryland and House Majority Leader Steny Hoyer.
Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
I thank the chair for yielding, and I rise in very strong support of this legislation. I want to just briefly respond to the remarks of the gentleman who preceded me about retrocession. Retrocession is an interesting idea that my Republican colleagues have. It has to do with the issue of 2 United States senators. One could say that has to do on both sides of the aisle, 2 United States senators. The history of adding states has been a history where focus is on those 2 United States senators that would be added. And the party that wanted them, the party that didn't want them. But retrocession, frankly, is an interesting idea, except for the fact that the gentleman talked about the Founding Fathers.
and James Madison, the Federalist Papers, and one of the articles of debate were if you had a state, i.e. Maryland, whose land, of course, the federal city is located on. Virginia gave some, but they took it back. You would have a state surrounding the federal enclave. No difference, except it would be Maryland and not Washington, Douglas Commonwealth. So that argument limps. It fails because you're suggesting the same thing that some have said is of concern to them. So the only difference is 2 senators. So this is about politics. Throughout history, people have guessed as to what the new states are going to be. Now, some knew, absolutely. We have North and South Dakota. I don't know whether any of you know why we have North and South Dakota. 2 senators versus 4 senators. And the Republicans who were in charge wanted to have 4 senators to assure their majority in the Senate as opposed to the Democrats in the South. Ironic how things change. So if you're voting on politics, I get it. But on principle, Nevada was added and taken from Utah, by the way, because the Republicans who were then in charge back in the day wanted to have 2 additional senators. And they got them. With less than 10,000 people living in the area that was taken from Utah, Wyoming, and Colorado and formed Nevada. So let's not get mired in these principled votes because this is about 2 senators. We get it. It is not about principle because there are over 700,000 people. 712 to be exact, maybe more when we get the census report, who are unequal citizens in America. I want to thank the incomparable Eleanor Holmes Norton for her hard work and tireless advocacy for so many years as the leader of this cause. On behalf of equal rights for the citizens she represents, without a vote. Why? Are they lesser citizens? Is she a lesser representative? Surely not. If a president of the United States, Republican or Democrat, asks somebody to come to the District of Columbia and work for the U.S. government, bring your talents, your energy, and your focus to work for your country in Washington, D.C. But, oh, by the way, you have to give up your vote in the Congress of the United States through your representative. In no other democracy are residents of the national capital excluded from representation. None. Frankly, I think the founders had no concept of how big this city would become, how vibrant it would become. None. Yet nearly 700,000 Americans are denied full representation. The founders of our Union of States set forth a simple process for the admission of new states to that union. They believed, the 13 of them, that adding new states would be positive for the country and that they would want people represented in the territories, in the Congress, when they became states and qualified to be such. They saw that process as an expansion both healthy and workable, and they believed that it would strengthen our democracy. Through the years, however, the admission of new states has been a very contentious process on both sides of the aisle. And there was a time in our history in the latter half of the 19th century when Republicans effected the admission of a number of new states in order to increase the numbers in the Senate. They accomplished that objective in some respects. In one noteworthy example, which I've just mentioned, Nevada in 1864, less than 10,000 people. The criteria at that point in time, theoretically, was 60,000. But it was ignored. It was ignored, 2 senators. That's what this issue is about. 2 senators. It is not about whether, on a principled basis, we ought to give to 712,000 of our citizens the right to be equally represented in the Congress of the United States. No, if they live here, we ask them to give up that right. That same process, as I mentioned, was repeated in the admission of North and South Dakota. They had hardly any people living there. They could hardly qualify if you put all the Dakota territory together, but what the Republicans did was, they were in charge at that point in time, they divided it, North and South Dakota. What happened? 2 extra senators. It wasn't about principle, about how many people, what the economic status was. It was about how many senators. When my friends across the aisle complained that this bill would lead to the election of 2 additional Democratic senators, so what? Is that the criteria? The political judgment of the citizens of some entity seeking to become a state? There's nothing in the Constitution about that. 0. It is the politics of it, I get it. But it is not the principle. I hope people vote on principle. That they believe that their fellow citizens who happen to live within this, used to be a square, but a square minus that to the south of the Potomac. This legislation is very different from the acts that admitted those states in the 19th century. It is different because it is based on the demonstrable need to provide representation to hundreds of thousands of Americans who deserve to have their voice heard in our democracy. And they have determined they want to be a part. Our founders were offended, indeed outraged, that they were forced to pay taxes but were afforded no representation in the body that set those taxes. Wouldn't all of us have been there at the Tea Party saying, you cannot tax us, England, without us having representation in the Parliament? I'm sure you've heard the argument from many people on this floor, I won't repeat them, about the level of taxation that is paid by the citizens of the District of Columbia. But they have no say in the level of those taxes, which so outraged our founders. Moreover, this legislation would end the unjust practice of treating D.C. residents differently than their fellow citizens in the 50 states when it comes to allocating resources or providing COVID-19 relief under the CARES Act last year. Mr. Speaker, when President Eisenhower, Republican president, but not a very partisan president, unlike today, where we have seen a very partisan president, no longer there. Mr. Speaker, when President Eisenhower addressed the question of admitting Hawaii as a state in the 1950s, he said the following, and by the way, I think all of you probably know that when Alaska and Hawaii were admitted not too far apart in years, Alaska was perceived to be a Democratic state and Hawaii was perceived to be a Republican state. So the assumption that somehow the District of Columbia will automatically elect 2 Democrats, which may be accurate, but it may not always be the case. The principle is what Eisenhower articulated. And he said this, you have an economy that is self-supporting, there is a large population, and I would like to see the case handled clearly and specifically on its merits. By that metric, Washington, D.C. earned its right to statehood a long time ago. And today we can take a major step toward that goal when we pass this bill, which we passed last Congress as well. And as to retrocession again, I wonder if Nevada would like to be back to Utah or to Wyoming, to Colorado, or whether Wyoming, that has 200,000 less citizens approximately than the District of Columbia, would like to be subsumed by one of the surrounding states because of the few numbers. Vermont as well, which was taken from another state, as was West Virginia. Took Virginia, part of Virginia. I hope the Senate will then take up this bill when we pass it and consider the question of D.C. statehood on its merits, not on politics. Maybe that's too much to ask. Not on partisan this is not a partisan math problem or electoral predictions, which, as we have seen, may or may not come to pass, but on the merits alone, on the conviction that taxation without representation is not fair now as it was not fair in 1776. The people of this city, our nation's capital, deserve full and equal representation in Congress. Mr. Speaker, I hope that this bill will pass with bipartisan support. It's going to pass, but I hope we have some bipartisan support based upon the principle that every citizen in our country ought to enjoy the same representation in the Congress of the United States as every other citizen. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. The gentlewoman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I must admit I'm a little disappointed in the remarks from the majority leader. When I saw him approach the podium, I thought he was going to give us a detailed explanation as to why he voted against this very bill in 1993. But instead, he lectures us on having the exact same position today that he had in 1993. The hypocrisy runs deep in this chamber, Mr. Speaker, and with that, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Higgins.
Mr. Speaker, the House is not in order.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. How is it unconstitutional? H.R. 51 violates our founders' intent, the actual writ of the Constitution, the land itself, which should rightfully be returned to Maryland if its original purpose as land for our nation's capital is discarded by Congress, and finally, the required repeal of the 23rd Amendment. I've explained these constitutional barriers for 2 years in committee, but there's more. D.C. does not perform many of the roles of a true state. A prime example, unlike every other state in the Union, D.C. is not responsible for its prison system. About 8,000 D.C. residents are inmates in federal prisons, and the federal government absorbs the huge expense. These are inmates who would normally be in a state prison, but D.C. only has the capacity to house inmates awaiting trial. 3 times in committee, I've offered an amendment that would transfer this normal state responsibility to D.C. My amendment was rejected by Democrats 3 times. So let's look at how D.C. has handled their inmates awaiting trial. According to the Washington Post, D.C. is essentially torturing these inmates with what experts say is mass solitary confinement. 23 hours a day of solitary for every D.C. inmate, ongoing for over 400 days. That is certainly a violation of the 8th Amendment. These are human beings awaiting final adjudication. Many will ultimately be found not guilty, yet they've been held in solitary confinement for 23 hours every day for over a year. Is this what we can expect from a D.C. state? D.C. is our nation's capital, was intended to be our nation's capital, and must remain our nation's capital. Mr. Speaker, I yield.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Kentucky reserves. The gentlewoman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, how much time remains on each side?
Gentlewoman from New York has 8.5 minutes. Gentleman from Kentucky has 16 minutes.
I reserve the time.
Gentlewoman reserves the time. Gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Sessions.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to revise and extend. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in opposition to H.R. 51, the Washington, D.C. Admissions Act. In many respects, America seems to be at the same point we were in the 1930s and 1940s, calling for a single-party rule from Washington, D.C. Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis at the time observed, "The greatest dangers to liberty lurk in insidious encroachment by men of zeal, well-meaning, but without understanding." These words of wisdom might also offer some inspiration to us here today. Whenever a people or an institution forgets its hard beginnings, it is beginning to decay, by Carl Sandburg. Mr. Speaker, both of these sayings are on the halls of our Capitol. Addressing people's ability to vote is important. Addressing a party's desire for singular political control of a nation is another matter. Our Constitution outlines the process for admitting new states to the Union and rules regarding the formation of the District of Columbia. In 1961, 36 states voted to ratify the 23rd Amendment to the Constitution, ensuring that the District of Columbia had representation and taxation. That was done out of fairness. These 36 states did this out of fairness. We've already heard what the Attorney General Robert Kennedy said. But, Mr. Speaker, today we're doing the inconceivable and will produce the absurdity. Legislation does not overrule a constitutional amendment. Legislation is subject to the Constitution and all of its amendments. If you want to make D.C. a state, have a process that overturns the 23rd Amendment and then ratify a 29th Amendment, which then repeals the 23rd Amendment. This was done by this country during Prohibition. This is the standard by which we take care of the Constitution and the amendments thereon. Our system of government is predictable on the rule of law and following procedure, but today's bill abandons that procedure of amendments to the Constitution in favor of politics.
Time has expired.
I yield back my time.
Gentleman from Kentucky reserves. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
I now yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Texas and chair of the Financial Services Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations, Representative Al Green.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, and still I rise, and today I rise with love of country at heart, and I rise to announce that I will not allow this issue to become so complicated that the American people might be confused. Because the truth is, we will be voting for one thing, whether we are for taxation without representation or whether we are against taxation without representation. It's really that simple. And as for me, I will be voting with the patriots. I will be voting with those patriots from 1773 who confronted the government. Those patriots who were there at the Boston Harbor. Those patriots who were there for the Boston Tea Party. I will be voting against taxation without representation. I believe that this is what the American Constitution and the American way is all about. Since 1773 it's been said, and today I will respect it with my vote. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Pfluger.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in opposition to this unconstitutional measure. Our founders debated the merits of statehood and a federal district and rightly concluded that no state should have supremacy over others and enjoy considerable benefits and influence of also being our national headquarters. Our founders got it right. This measure gets it wrong. If D.C. surrenders the special status of our federal district and instead becomes one of 51 equals, why should it enjoy all the benefits of also being the federal district? Perhaps federal agencies like Energy or USDA should move to places like West Texas, where we actually produce food and fuel for the nation and beyond. Ambitions on the political left to expand the Supreme Court and U.S. Senate seats, limit the filibuster, keep 3 electoral votes for occupants of the White House, all while controlling our election law, are one thing. They are for one thing: more power for them. Oppose this unconstitutional measure. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman from Texas yields back. Gentleman from Kentucky reserves. The gentlewoman from New York is recognized.
The gentleman describes, as many on the other side, this is at a political issue, a power grab. He cites all these other political actions. But the real power grab is denying 712,000 tax-paying American citizens the right to vote. That's the power grab. This isn't about politics. It's a fundamental voting and civil rights issue. And it is outrageous that Republicans would play partisan politics just to block 712,000 Americans from having full equality in our democracy. Every American deserves a voice in their government. Taxation without representation, fundamental beliefs in our democracy. I reserve.
Gentlewoman reserves. Gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Good.
Gentleman from Virginia is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the gentleman from Kentucky. I rise in opposition to this latest attempt by the Democrats to increase their power at the expense of longstanding American traditions and the Constitution. Sadly, this is not at all surprising. Democrats have made it clear that American institutions don't stand in their way of advancing their political agenda at all costs. They want to pack the Supreme Court, eliminate election integrity, defund our police, keep our borders open, and prohibit debate in this very House. And D.C. statehood is just the next step. This legislation is an unconstitutional power grab designed to give Democrats more votes to pass their radical socialist agenda. As the majority leader just said, this is about 2 senators. It's not about principle. The District of Columbia has served as the federal district for over 200 years. The framers understood the importance of federal and state governments having separate authority and recognized that states would be ill-suited to house the federal government. And this was long before the Democrats started making everything about race. Now Democrats want to disregard the founders' vision, again, in order to grab 2 more votes in the Senate. Political advantage is no justification for policy that disregards precedent and the Constitution, and therefore I oppose this bill. And I yield my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Kentucky reserves. The gentlewoman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 1 minute and a half to the gentleman from Virginia, Chair of the Joint Economic Committee, Congressman Don Beyer.
Gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in strong support of H.R. 51 and D.C. statehood. My mother and father met at D.C.'s Western High School in the 1940s before my father went off to West Point and Korea. I was raised in the Potomac Palisades of Washington and went to high school a few blocks from the Capitol. My grandchildren are 5th-generation Washingtonians. And through the generations, we've been confounded and confused that the United States citizens who live in the District of Columbia have been denied self-rule. The right to self-determination is the defining principle on which this nation was founded, and yet this very right is denied to those who reside in our nation's capital. Taxation without representation sparked our own war of independence from the Great Britain. Today, the same cry for democracy, impressed on every D.C. license plate, calls out for the peaceful passage of H.R. 51. The American citizens of the District of Columbia overwhelmingly support statehood, passing a statehood referendum with 85% support in 2016. My Republican statehood opponents argue that statehood should be denied D.C. because it is too small, because it is not rural enough, because it has insufficient logging, manufacturing, agriculture, or mining, because it is not well-rounded, and because its residents are not real Americans. D.C. does, by the way, have a Tesla car dealership. The real reason my Republican friends oppose statehood is that they disagree with the political views of today's Washingtonians. But this is terrible short-term thinking. Texas voted Democratic for generations.
while California and New York have had elected many Republican governors and senators. Political pendulums swing both ways. But this view betrays our democratic principles upon which our nation is founded. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentlewoman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from South Dakota, Mr. Johnson.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I am opposed to D.C. statehood, but I am not opposed to suffrage. If your goal is truly suffrage, rather than increasing Democratic control of the Senate, boy, do I have a plan for you. My bill would reunite the residential areas of the district with Maryland, as was done with Virginia in 1847. This plan would give full voting rights that we have heard so much about this morning, without ignoring the Constitution or the practical realities of what constitutes a state. And so I say to my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, if your goal is truly suffrage, then let's do this together. Let's set aside the divisive rhetoric we have heard and work together to craft an appropriate and bipartisan solution to give representation to the people of D.C. Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Kentucky reserves. The gentlewoman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I reserve.
Gentlewoman reserves. Gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
1 minute. 2? 1 minute, yeah. Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Gomer.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It was good to hear the majority leader say this is about politics. We knew that. But for some of us, it is about principle. And if it were about taxation without representation, I would have a slew of Democrats co-sponsoring the bill I've been filing for many terms to eliminate federal income tax in the District of Columbia. But I was told years ago, we're not going to join in with your bill because it'll weaken our chance to get a representative full voting from D.C. That's what this has been about. For some of us, principle is a big deal. When the Bush Justice Department was violating constitutional rights, some Republicans got furious. When the Obama administration did that, they circled the wagons and protected. This is about principle for some of us, and we got a tiny taste when the mayor of D.C., of an opposite party of President Trump, wasn't sure she was going to provide the police to protect the White House. This is about the Constitution and principle. Vote against this.
Gentleman yields back. A gentleman from Kentucky reserves. The gentlewoman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, may I inquire about the remaining time on both sides?
Gentlewoman has 5 minutes remaining. Gentleman from Kentucky has 10 minutes remaining.
I now yield 1 minute to the gentlelady from Michigan and chairwoman of the Committee on Science, Space, and Technology Subcommittee on Research Technology, Haley Stevens.
Gentlewoman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in support of H.R. 51 in the esteemed tradition, the responsibility that we have of legislators of this body to evaluate adding a 51st state to this union, to form a more perfect union, yes, in the tradition and in the written words of our Constitution, because as when my native Michigan became the 26th state in 1837, added to this union, the president recognized that we will admit Michigan on equal footing. But we know that the founders and the originators of our beautiful nation did not know a Michigan when they were writing our Constitution. They did not know a Wyoming. And so we ask ourselves here as the ambassadors of democracy, what message we send to the world when we deny over 700,000 people the right to vote, when we tax them without the proper representation. This, my friends, is an exciting and profound and welcome day in this body that deserves debate, and this legislation deserves to pass. Thank you, and I yield back.
Yields back. Gentlewoman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from California, Mr. LaMalfa.
Gentleman from California is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you. I'm amazed at the smoke and mirrors and fog of obfuscation surrounding the debate on this bill. What Republicans are doing here today is defending the Constitution, what was put in place by the founders, that Washington, D.C., the district, would not be part of a state where it could be coerced or leveraged by a state to get things from it. I've just heard in the last few minutes solutions offered by two of my colleagues that could probably be passed in 6 weeks or less to allow what it is they claim they're saying for the citizens of Washington, D.C. Folding those 700,000 residents through a Maryland retrocession, as has happened with Virginia in 1846, would accomplish the goal of the same type of representation they're talking about. No, the politics is over on that side of the aisle because they have turned down a constitutional solution that this would be, instead for an unconstitutional one that flies in the face and produces a 66 square mile state that is 1/18 the size of Rhode Island, with the population just a little bit larger than the city of Fresno, California, because they want to accomplish a political goal while we defend the Constitution. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Kentucky reserves. The gentlewoman from New York is recognized.
I reserve.
Gentlewoman reserves. The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Harris. I'm sorry.
Gentleman from Maryland is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I guess it's appropriate for someone from Maryland to speak on this issue because this is Maryland's land we're talking about. This land was given for the purpose of a federal enclave by Maryland. How dare the Congress take Maryland's land from it? That's not why it was given. But, Mr. Speaker, let's talk about the unconstitutional. Well, you've heard about the unconstitutionality. We don't need to talk about it anymore. I urge everyone who's watching us on C-SPAN today, go get your copy of the Constitution. It's written in black and white. This is very plain. This is clearly unconstitutional. But, Mr. Speaker, I hope America was paying attention to the majority leader's speech. That one line where he said, this is all about politics. In fact, he even gave the history. He said, well, in the past, the Republicans wanted senators and so wanted senators, so they made. We don't live in the past. We live in the present. Mr. Speaker, is this what America wants? Do they want pure politics? That's what not my words. That's what the majority leader said. This is all about politics. Now, Mr. Speaker, let's ask, why did our founders do what they did? Every American who's watching, think about what you saw last summer. You saw a White House under siege. You saw a mob. And we know members of this House have promoted mobs. They did it last weekend. It'll happen again. If we put the boundary next to the federal buildings, it'll be subject to a mob controlled by a state, not a federal enclave. That is the last thing this country needs. It's the last thing the federal government needs. I see my colleagues on the other side of that shaking their head. How else would one describe that group outside the White House? It was an uncontrolled mob. Thank God that federal troops were allowed to be there, federal forces, federal law enforcement, to stop that mob. That's why we need the District of Columbia to be the federal enclave. I oppose the bill, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Kentucky reserves. The gentlewoman from New York is recognized.
I now yield 1 minute to the gentleman from the great state of New York, Congressman Mondale Jones.
Gentleman from New York is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I have had enough of my colleagues' racist insinuations that somehow the people of Washington, D.C. are incapable or even unworthy of our democracy. One Senate Republican said that D.C. wouldn't be a, quote, well-rounded working class state. I had no idea there were so many syllables in the word white. One of my House Republican colleagues said that D.C. shouldn't be a state because the district doesn't have a landfill. My goodness, with all the racist trash my colleagues have brought to this debate, I can see why they're worried about having a place to put it. The truth is, there is no good faith argument for disenfranchising over 700,000 people, Mr. Speaker, most of whom are people of color.
Probably wouldn't pass.
Was that?
Probably wouldn't pass. Gentleman's time was not timely.
Mr. Speaker, point
demand
of
was
order.
not timely. The gentleman from New York will proceed.
The rules say make the point of order when the words need to be taken. He has to be recognized, Mr. Speaker. We understand parliamentary procedure.
The debate has proceeded and the ban was not timely. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
The truth is, there is no good faith argument for disenfranchising.
Is the gentleman from consent to withdraw his words?
Does the gentleman from New York ask for unanimous consent to withdraw the words?
Mr. Speaker, that's fine. You have my consent to withdraw.
Gentleman withdraws his words. Debate is going to continue. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The truth is, there is no good faith argument for disenfranchising over 700,000 people, most of whom are people of color. These desperate objections are about fear. Fear that in D.C. their white supremacist politics will no longer play. Fear that soon enough white supremacist politics won't work anywhere in America. Fear that if they don't rig our democracy, they will not win. Today, Democrats are standing up for a multiracial democracy to democratize all 51 states in this country. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Woman from New York is reserves. Gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2.5 minutes to the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Griffith.
Gentleman from Virginia is recognized for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. D.C. statehood is unconstitutional. Both Republican and Democrat administrations of the past have long interpreted the Constitution in that fashion. One of the problems with D.C. statehood is that two states, my home state of Virginia and Maryland, gave land for the seat of government, and they did not do so with the intent to create a new state. When Virginia's land wasn't used for the seat of government, Congress ceded it back to Virginia. It did not create a new state. As it was then, retrocession is our best course of action today. Shrinking the seat of government, which is permitted by Article 1, and returning the rest to Maryland for the purposes of representation, offers D.C. residents a voice in the federal legislative branch and keeps faith with Maryland's original cession of land for D.C. It also works within the bounds of the Constitution. Now, I've introduced a bill, and it's later going to be a motion to recommit, and I have also taken great care as a part of that to make sure that retrocession and the transfer of administrative functions from D.C. to Maryland run as smoothly as possible. If you're worried about the details of D.C. government, this bill, this motion to recommit, takes care of them. As the old Prego commercials say, it's in there. Congressional representation, it's in there. The courts, it's in there. The National Guard, it's in there. Commitments to retirees, it's in there. Tuition assistance, it's in there. Preventing the remaining federal district from casting the 3 electoral votes meant for D.C., it's in there. My motion to recommit, which I will offer in a bit, is the most practical solution to giving D.C. residents a voice in Congress, to give them a right to vote. Mr. Speaker, if we adopt the motion to recommit, we will instruct the Committee on Oversight and Reform to consider my amendment to H.R. 51 to provide for the retrocession of land to the state of Maryland rather than to create a new state. I ask unanimous consent to insert the text of the amendment in the record immediately prior to the vote on the motion to recommit.
Without objection.
And I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Kentucky reserves. Gentlewoman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I now grant a minute and a half to the distinguished constitutional scholar, Congressman Raskin from Maryland.
Gentleman from Maryland is recognized for a minute and a half.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Madam Chair. I hope that our distinguished colleagues don't flatter themselves to think that they're the first members of Congress who oppose other Americans' democratic rights to wrap their arguments in constitutional clothing, because this has actually been the standard in American history. With Texas, it was said Texas could not be admitted because it would be unconstitutional because it was its own country, and the Constitution nowhere gives Congress the power to admit a foreign republic as a state. It was said Hawaii and Alaska could not be admitted because they weren't contiguous. West Virginia, everyone knew, couldn't be admitted because it used to be part of Virginia, just like Kentucky was part of Virginia. Oklahoma, it was said, was too poor and therefore did not meet constitutional requisites. Utah was too Mormon. New Mexico was too Catholic, and on and on and on. So this is very much in the mainstream of partisan political opposition to vindicating the rights of American citizens. A colleague from Virginia invites us to say, well, just give Washington, D.C. back to Maryland, thereby conceding, of course, that Congress has the power to modify the boundaries of the District of Columbia, as was established in 1847 with the retrocession of Virginia. There's one problem with his argument. The people of Washington, D.C. haven't asked to go back to Maryland, and Maryland has not requested that the land be given back to Maryland. Instead, what we have is American citizens exercising their rights under the 9th Amendment to the Constitution, organizing a new state and petitioning for admission to the Union. That is how America has grown. They've demonstrated their commitment to our democracy by defending us against violent insurrectionists on January 6th. Let's show our commitment to their democratic rights.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentlewoman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I have no further speakers, and I'm prepared to close.
Gentleman reserves. Gentlewoman from New York is recognized.
We have no more speakers and are prepared to close, if my colleagues on the Republican side as well, so we are prepared to close.
Gentlewoman reserves. Gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wonder, listening to the debate, if our friends on the other side of the aisle would be so passionate if Washington, D.C. were 90% Republican as 90% Democrat. H.R. 51 goes against the Founding Fathers' intent and is unconstitutional, impractical, and a blatant power grab. The Founding Fathers created the federal city, this federal city, to be separate and apart for the states, which it would serve as the seat of government. They designed it this way so there would be no superstate that could unduly influence federal affairs and international relations. Now, I understand the people of D.C.'s desire for representation in Congress. I think that's a legitimate concern, and it's not a new one. If Democrats truly wanted to grant the wishes of D.C. residents, then they would address the constitutional issues with H.R. 51, since it does not stand a chance in court. We all know that. This does not stand one chance in court. Additionally, Democrats could explore other options other than statehood, but they're not interested in any of them since they don't add 2 new progressive senators to the U.S. Senate. Serious policy proposals like retrocession, allowing D.C. residents to vote in Maryland, federal elections, and most obviously the passage of the constitutional amendment have been called for by many of my Republican colleagues. No state has required a constitutional amendment to be admitted to the Union. Not one. But D.C. is unique. The 23rd Amendment guarantees the district 3 electoral college votes. There is no precedent for granting statehood to a territory with electoral college votes or such a special place in our Constitution. H.R. 51 is an unconstitutional bill. D.C. is also massively unprepared to assume the cost of the programs and benefits it receives by being the federal seat of government. The new state will very likely levy a commuter tax to make up the funding gaps currently backed by the federal taxpayers. H.R. 51 provides no guarantee to the American people that they will not be on the hook funding the new state for years, if not decades. This bill is nothing more than an attempt to ignore the constitutional process and gain an advantage in the U.S. Senate, all to advance a radical agenda that continues to come out of this House and stalls in the Senate. Democrats know a constitutional amendment granting D.C. statehood would be rejected, just as it has been in the past. H.R. 51 is intentionally designed to circumvent the Constitution and the will of the American people. I urge my colleagues to reject this unconstitutional and impractical legislation. I urge a no vote and yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Kentucky yields back the balance of his time. Gentlewoman from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Statehood for D.C. is about fairness, justice, and ensuring that all Americans have an equal stake in our republic. It is not unconstitutional, it is constitutional, and this is not about politics. It's a fundamental voting and civil rights issue. The real wrong is denying 712,000 tax-paying American citizens the right to vote. Our nation is founded upon the principle that all people should have a voice in their government. No taxation without representation. But without voting representation in Congress, the people of D.C. are denied that most basic, fundamental right. Today's debate forces us to confront the fundamental question of who we are as a nation. Do we believe in the right to full and equal representation, or are these just empty words? D.C. residents are Americans, and they deserve the equal rights our national ideals promise them. I want to again thank the outstanding Congresswoman for her tireless and selfless advocacy to ensure that D.C. residents finally gain full representation they deserve. I join many in thanking the leadership of the Democratic Caucus, Speaker Nancy Pelosi, Majority Leader Hoyer, Whip James Clyburn, and I urge a yes vote in favor of this critical civil rights bill, and I yield back.
Pursuant to House Resolution 330, the previous question is ordered on the bill as amended. The question is on the engrossment and third reading of the bill. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. The ayes have it. Third reading.
A bill to provide for the admission of the state of Washington, D.C. into the Union.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Virginia seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I have a motion to recommit at the desk.
The clerk will report the motion.
Mr. Griffith of Virginia moves to recommit the bill H.R. 51 to the Committee on Oversight and Reform.
Pursuant to Clause 2B of Rule 19, the previous question is ordered on the motion to recommit. The question is on the motion. All those in favor say aye. All those opposed say no. The noes have it. The motion is not agreed to.
Mr. Speaker.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Virginia seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I request the ayes and nays.
Pursuant to Section 3S of House Resolution 8, the yeas and nays are ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. For what purpose does the gentleman from South Carolina seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as a member designated by Mr. Wilson of South Carolina pursuant to H.Res. 8, I inform the House that Mr. Wilson will vote aye on the motion to recommit. As a member designated by Mr. Gonzalez of Ohio pursuant to H.Res. 8, I inform the House that Mr. Gonzalez will vote aye on the motion to recommit.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Illinois seek recognition?
As the member designated by Mr. Rush pursuant to H.Res. 8, I inform the House that Mr. Rush will vote no on the motion to recommit.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Missouri seek recognition?
Can't hear anything. Are the mics on?
Tap the
I think the
gavel.
mic's on.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Missouri seek recognition?
As a member designated by Mrs. Wolarski of Indiana pursuant to HRES 8, I inform the House that Mrs. Wolarski will vote yay on the motion to recommit.
From Virginia seek recognition.
Mr. Speaker, as the member designated by Ms. Barragan of California, pursuant to HRES 8, I inform the House that Ms. Barragan will vote no on the motion to recommit. As a member designated by Mr. Liu of California, pursuant to HRES 8, I inform the House that Mr. Liu will vote no on the motion to recommit. As a member designated by Mr. Lowenthal of California, pursuant to HRES 8, I inform the House that Mr. Lowenthal will vote no on the motion to recommit.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Maryland seek recognition?
As a member designated by Mr. Rupersberger, pursuant to House Resolution 8, I inform the House that Mr. Rupersberger will vote no on the motion to recommit.
Purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
As the member designated by Mr. Khanna pursuant to H-Res 8, I inform the House that Mr. Khanna will vote no on the motion to recommit.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Pennsylvania seek recognition?
Good morning, Mr. Speaker. As a member designated by Mr. Doyle of Pennsylvania pursuant to House Resolution 8, I hereby inform the House that Mr. Doyle will vote no on the motion to recommit.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Illinois seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as the member designated by Mr. Grijalva pursuant to H-Res 8, I inform the House that Mr. Grijalva will vote no on the motion to recommit.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Pennsylvania seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as a member designated by Mr. Lawson of Florida, pursuant to House Resolution 8, I inform the House that Mr. Lawson votes no on the motion to recommit.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Massachusetts seek recognition?
As the member designated by Ms. Mang pursuant to H-Res 8, I inform the House that Ms. Mang will vote no on the motion to recommit.
For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as a member designated by Mr. Nunes of California pursuant to House Resolution 8, I inform the House that Mr. Nunes will vote yes on the motion to recommit.
From Arizona seek recognition.
Mr. Chair, as the member designated by Ms. Kirkpatrick pursuant to H-Res 8, I inform the House that Ms. Kirkpatrick will vote no on the motion to recommit.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as the member designated by Mr. Babin, the great state of Texas, pursuant to House Resolution 8, I inform the House that Mr. Babin will vote yes on the motion to recommit.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Virginia seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as the member designated by Mr. Mafumi of Maryland, pursuant to H.Res. 8, I inform the House that Mr. Mafumi will vote no on the motion to recommit.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Washington seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as the member designated by Ms. Sewell, pursuant to H.Res. 8, I inform the House that Ms. Sewell will vote no on the motion to recommit.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Massachusetts seek recognition?
Good morning, Mr. Speaker. As the member designated by the Honorable Ms. Laurie Trahan of Massachusetts, and pursuant to House Resolution 8, I'd like to inform the House that Ms. Trahan will vote no on the motion to recommit H.R. 51, the Washington, D.C. Admission Act. And, Mr. Speaker, as the member designated by the Honorable Mr. James Langevin of Rhode Island, I'd like to inform the House that Mr. Langevin will also vote no on the motion to recommit H.R. 51. Thank you.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Georgia seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, pursuant to the House Resolution 8, as the member designated by Mr. Gosar of Arizona, I inform the House that Mr. Gosar will vote aye on H.R. 51.
For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as member designated by Congressmember Napolitano, pursuant to House Resolution 8, I inform the House that Congressmember Napolitano will vote no on the motion to recommit. And Mr. Speaker, as member designated by Congressmember Costa, pursuant to House Resolution 8, I inform the House that Congressmember Costa will vote no on the motion to recommit.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Connecticut seek recognition?
As the member designated by Ms. Wilson, pursuant to H.Res. 8, I inform the House that Ms. Wilson will vote no on the motion to recommit. Hello, thank you. Yes.
No, shush.
For what purpose does... For what purpose does the gentleman from Colorado seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
as a member designated by Mr. Moulton of Massachusetts pursuant to HRS 8, I inform the House that Mr. Moulton will vote no on the motion to recommit.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Massachusetts seek recognition?
As the member designated by Mr. Welsh of Vermont pursuant to HRS 8, I inform the House that Mr. Welsh will vote no on the motion to recommit.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Pennsylvania seek recognition?
As the member designated by Ms. Spear pursuant to HRS 8, I inform the House that Ms. Spear will vote no on the motion to recommit.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, thank you. As member designated by Mr. Crenshaw pursuant to House Resolution 8, I'd like to inform the House that Mr. Crenshaw will be voting aye on the motion to recommit. Thank you.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Virginia seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as the member designated by Mr. Allred pursuant to HRS 8, I inform the House that Mr. Allred will vote no on the motion to recommit. And as the member designated by Ms. Porter pursuant to HRS 8, I inform the House that Ms. Porter will vote no on the motion to recommit.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as the member designated by Ms. Leger-Fernandez pursuant to HRS 8, I inform the House that Ms. Leger-Fernandez will vote no on the motion to recommit.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Missouri seek recognition?
Han Omar pursuant to HRS 8, I inform the House that Ms. Omar will vote no on the motion to recommit.
For what purpose does the gentleman from New Jersey seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as the member designated by Ms. Bonnie Watson Coleman pursuant to HRS 8, I inform the House that Ms. Watson Coleman will vote no on the motion to recommit. And as the member designated by Mr. Donald Payne pursuant to HRS 8, I inform the House that Mr. Payne will vote no on the motion to recommit. And finally, as the member designated by Mr. Albio Ceres pursuant to HRS 8, I inform the House that Mr. Ceres will vote no on the motion to recommit.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Arizona seek recognition?
As a member designated by Representative Cardenas pursuant to H.R. 8, I inform the House Representative Cardenas will vote no on the motion to recommit.
Purpose, does the gentlewoman from Florida seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the member designated by Mr. Donalds of the state of Florida pursuant to H.Res. 8, I inform the House that Mr. Donalds will vote yea on the motion to recommit. As the member, no.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Florida seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the member designated by Mr. McHenry of the state of North Carolina, pursuant to H.Res. 8, I inform the House that Mr. McHenry will vote yea on the motion to recommit.
Vote. The ayes are 205 and the nays are 215. The motion is not adopted. The question is on passage of the bill. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
Mr. Speaker, I ask for the yeas and nays.
Mr. Speaker,
Pursuant to Section 3S of House Resolution 8, the yeas and nays are ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
As the member designated by Mr. Khanna pursuant to H.Res. 8, I inform the House that Mr. Khanna will vote aye on H.R. 51.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as member designated by Mr. Dan Crenshaw pursuant to House Resolution 8, I'd like to inform the House that Mr. Crenshaw will be voting nay on House Resolution 51.
Gentleman from Arizona seek recognition.
As the member designated by Ms. Kirkpatrick pursuant to H.Res. 8, I inform the House that Ms. Kirkpatrick will vote yes on H.R. 51.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Massachusetts seek recognition?
As the member designated by Mr. Welsh of Vermont pursuant to H.Res. 8, I will inform the House that Mr. Welsh will vote yes on H.R. 51.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Florida seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the member designated by Mr. Donalds of the state of Florida pursuant to H.Res. 8, I inform the House that Mr. Donalds will vote nay on H.R. 51. As the member designated by Mr. McHenry of the state of North Carolina pursuant to H.Res. 8, I inform the House that Mr. McHenry will vote nay on H.R. 51.
From Virginia seek recognition.
Mr. Speaker, as the member designated by Mr. Mafumi of Maryland, pursuant to H.Res. 8, I inform the House that Mr. Mafumi will vote yes on H.R. 51.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Virginia seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the member designated by Mr. Allred pursuant to H.Res. 8, I inform the House that Mr. Allred will vote yes on H.R. 51. And as the member designated by Ms. Porter pursuant to H.Res. 8, I inform the House that Ms. Porter will vote yes on H.R. 51.
For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as a member designated by Mr. Nunes of California pursuant to House Resolution 8, I inform the House that Mr. Nunes will vote no on H.R. 51.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Pennsylvania seek recognition?
As the member designated by Ms. Spear pursuant to H.Res. 8, I inform the House that Ms. Spear will vote yes on H.R. 51.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Virginia seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as the member designated by Ms. Barragan pursuant to H.Res. 8, and for the House of Ms. Barragan will vote yes on H.R. 51. As the member designated by Mr. Liu pursuant to H.Res. 8, I inform the House Mr. Liu will vote yes on H.R. 51. As the member designated by Mr. Lowenthal pursuant to H.Res. 8, I inform the House Mr. Lowenthal will vote yes on H.R. 51.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Pennsylvania seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as the member designated pursuant to House Resolution 8 by Mr. Doyle of Pennsylvania, I will hereby inform the House that Mr. Doyle will vote yes on H.R. 51.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Connecticut seek recognition?
As the member designated by Ms. Wilson pursuant to H.Res. 8, I inform the House that Ms. Wilson will vote yes on H.R. 51.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as a member designated by Mr. Babin from the great state of Texas, pursuant to House Resolution 8, I inform the House that Mr. Babin will vote no on H.R. 51.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Missouri seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the member designated by Ms. Ilhan Omar, pursuant to H.Res. 8, I inform the House that Ms. Omar will vote yes on H.R. 51.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Georgia seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, pursuant to House Resolution 8, as the member designated by Mr. Gosar of Arizona, I inform the House that Mr. Gosar will vote no on H.R. 51.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Pennsylvania seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as the member designated by Mr. Lawson of Florida, pursuant to House Resolution 8, I inform the House that Mr. Lawson will vote yes on final passage.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as a member designated by Ms. Leger Fernandez pursuant to H.Res. 8, I inform the House that Ms. Leger Fernandez will vote yes on H.R. 51.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Illinois seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as the member designated by Mr. Grijalva pursuant to H.Res. 8, I inform the House that Mr. Grijalva will vote aye on H.R. 51.
Purpose does the gentleman from Arizona seek recognition?
As a member designated by Representative Cardenas to H.R. 8, I inform the House Representative Cardenas will vote aye on H.R. 51.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Washington seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as the member designated by Ms. Sewell pursuant to H.Res. 8, I inform the House that Ms. Sewell will vote yes on H.R. 51.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Missouri seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as a member designated by Mrs. Wolarski of Indiana, pursuant to H.Res. 8, I inform the House that Ms. Wolarski will vote nay on H.R. 51.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Massachusetts seek recognition?
Good morning, Mr. Speaker. As the member designated by the Honorable Miss Laurie Trahan of Massachusetts and pursuant to House Resolution 8, I'd like to inform the House that Ms. Trahan will vote yes on H.R. 51, the Washington, D.C. Admissions Act. And Mr. Speaker, as the member designated by the Honorable Mr. James Langevin of Rhode Island, pursuant to House Resolution 8, I'd like to inform the House that Mr. Langevin will also vote yes on H.R. 51, the Washington, D.C. Admission Act. Thank you.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Colorado seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as the member designated by Mr. Moulton of Massachusetts pursuant to H.Res. 8, I inform the House that Mr. Moulton will vote yes on H.R. 51.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Massachusetts seek recognition?
As the member designated by Ms. Meng pursuant to H.Res. 8, I inform the House that Ms. Meng will vote yes on H.R. 51.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Maryland seek recognition?
As the member designated by Mr. Rupersberger, pursuant to House Resolution 8, I rise to inform the House that Mr. Rupersberger will vote aye on H.R. 51, the Washington, D.C. Admission Act.
For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as member designated by Congressmember Costa, pursuant to House Resolution 8, I inform the House that Congressmember Costa will vote yes on H.R. 51. And Mr. Speaker, as member designated by Congressmember Napolitano, pursuant to House Resolution 8, I inform the House that Congressmember Napolitano will vote yes on H.R. 51.
For what purpose does the gentleman from New Jersey seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as the member designated by Ms. Bonnie Watson Coleman pursuant to H.Res. 8, I inform the House that Ms. Watson Coleman will vote yes on H.R. 51. As the member designated by Mr. Donald Payne pursuant to H.Res. 8, I inform the House that Mr. Payne will vote yes on H.R. 51. And as the member designated by Mr. Albio Series pursuant to H.Res. 8, I inform the House that Mr. Series will vote yes on H.R. 51.
For what purpose does the gentleman? For what purpose does the gentleman? For what purpose does the gentleman from South Carolina seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as a member designated by Mr. Wilson of South Carolina pursuant to H.Res. 8, I inform the House that Mr. Wilson will vote nay on H.R. 51. Mr. Speaker, as the member designated by Mr. Gonzalez of Ohio pursuant to H.Res. 8, I inform the House that Mr. Gonzalez will vote nay on H.R. 51.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Illinois seek recognition?
As a member designated by Mr. Rush pursuant to H.Res. 8, I inform the House that Mr. Rush will vote yes on H.R. 51.
For what purpose? For what purpose does the gentleman from New York seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as a member designated by Ms. Stefanik, pursuant to H.Res. 8, I inform the House that Ms. Stefanik will vote no on H.R. 51.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Ohio seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the member designated by Mr. Gibbs pursuant to House Resolution 8, I inform the House that Mr. Gibbs will vote no on H.R. 51. Thank you.
Have all members voted? Does any member wish to change their vote?
On this vote, the yeas are 216, the nays are 208. The bill is passed. Without objection, a motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, the unfinished business is the vote on the motion to table, the motion to reconsider the vote on the motion to suspend the rules and pass H.R. 367, H.R. 370, H.R. 396, H.R. 397, H.R. 408, H.R. 490, H.R. 965, H.R. 1251, H.R. 1395, H.R. 1491, H.R. 1528, H.R. 1532, H.R. 1565, H.R. 1602, and H.R. 2523, and agree to House Resolution 124, on which the yeas and nays are ordered. The clerk will report the titles of the bills and the resolution.
H.R. 367, a bill to amend the Homeland Security Act of 2002 to establish an acquisition professional career program and for other purposes. H.R. 370, a bill to amend the Homeland Security Act of 2002 to make technical corrections to the requirement that the Secretary of Homeland Security submit quadrennial Homeland Security reviews and for other purposes. H.R. 396, a bill to amend the implementing recommendations of the 9/11 Commission Act of 2007 to clarify certain allowable uses of funds for public transportation security assistance grants and establish periods of performance for such grants and for other purposes. H.R. 397, a bill to amend the Homeland Security Act of 2002 to establish chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear intelligence and information sharing functions of the Office of Intelligence and Analysis of the Department of Homeland Security, and to require dissemination of information analyzed by the Department to entities with responsibilities relating to Homeland Security and for other purposes. H.R. 408, a bill to amend the Homeland Security Act of 2002 to establish a mentor-protege program and for other purposes. H.R. 490, a bill to amend the Homeland Security Act of 2002 to improve morale within the Department of Homeland Security workforce by conferring new responsibilities to the Chief Human Capital Officer, establishing an Employee Engagement Steering Committee, requiring action plans, and authorizing an annual employee award program and for other purposes. H.R. 965, a bill to establish a comprehensive United States government initiative to build the capacity of young leaders and entrepreneurs in Africa and for other purposes. H.R. 1251, a bill to support United States international cyber diplomacy and for other purposes. H.R. 1395, a bill to require the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development to discount FHA single-family mortgage insurance premium payments for first-time homebuyers who complete a financial literacy housing counseling program. H.R. 1491, a bill to amend the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act to provide enhanced protection against debt collector harassment of members of the armed forces and for other purposes. H.R. 1528, a bill to require the Securities and Exchange Commission to carry out a study of Rule 10b5-1 trading plans and for other purposes. H.R. 1532, a bill to require a review of the effects of FHA mortgage insurance policies, practices, and products on small dollar mortgage lending and for other purposes. H.R. 1565, a bill to create an interdivisional task force at the Securities and Exchange Commission for senior investors. H.R. 1602, a bill to direct the Commodity Futures Trading Commission and the Securities and Exchange Commission to jointly establish a digital asset working group and for other purposes. H.R. 2523, a bill to amend the American Rescue Plan Act of 2021 to improve the COVID-19 Veteran Rapid Retraining Assistance Program, to make certain technical corrections to the Johnny Isaacson and David P. Rowe, MD, Veterans Healthcare and Benefits Improvement Act of 2020 and for other purposes. House Resolution 124, resolution supporting the people of Belarus and their democratic aspirations and condemning the election rigging and subsequent violent crackdowns on peaceful protesters by the illegitimate Lukashenko regime.
The question is on the motion to table. Members will record their votes by electronic device. For what purpose does the gentleman from Colorado seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the member designated by Mr. Moulton of Massachusetts, pursuant to H.Res. 8, I inform the House that Mr. Moulton will vote yes on the motion to table.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Missouri seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as a member designated by Mrs. Wolarski pursuant to H.Res. 8, I inform the House that Ms. Wolarski will vote yea on the motion to table.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Illinois seek recognition?
As a member designated by Mr. Rush pursuant to H.Res. 8, I inform the House that Mr. Rush will vote yes on the motion to table.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Virginia seek recognition?
As the member designated by Mr. Allred pursuant to H-Res 8, I inform the House that Mr. Allred will vote yes on the motion to table. And as the member designated by Ms. Porter pursuant to H-Res 8, I inform the House that Ms. Porter will vote yes on the motion to table.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Missouri seek recognition?
As the member designated by Ms. Ilhan Omar pursuant to H-Res 8, I inform the House that Ms. Omar will vote yes on the motion to table.
Does the gentleman from New York seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as a member designated by Ms. Stefanik, pursuant to H-Res 8, I inform the House that Ms. Stefanik will vote yes on the motion to table.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Washington seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as the member designated by Ms. Sewell pursuant to H-Res 8, I inform the House that Ms. Sewell will vote yes on the motion to table.
Gentleman from California seek recognition.
Mr. Speaker, as the member designated by Mr. Nunes of California pursuant to H-Res 8, I inform the House that Mr. Nunes will vote no on the motion to table.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Pennsylvania seek recognition?
As the member designated by Ms. Spear pursuant to H-Res 8, I inform the House that Ms. Spear will vote yes on the motion to table.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Georgia seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, pursuant to the House Resolution 8, as the member designated by Mr. Gosar of Arizona, I inform the House that Mr. Gosar will vote no on the motion to reconsider.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Virginia seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as the member designated by Mr. Mafumi of Maryland, pursuant to H-Res 8, I inform the House Mr. Mafumi will vote yes on the motion to table.
For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as a member designated by Mr. Nunes pursuant to H-Res 8, I inform the House that Mr. Nunes will change his vote to yea on the motion to table.
For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as the member designated by Mr. Khanna pursuant to H-Res 8, I inform the House that Mr. Khanna will vote aye on the motion to table.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Florida seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the member designated by Mr. Donalds of Florida pursuant to H-Res 8, I inform the House that Mr. Donalds will vote nay on the motion to table. As the member designated by Mr. McHenry of North Carolina pursuant to H-Res 8, I inform the House that Mr. McHenry will vote yea on the motion to table.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Virginia seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as the member designated by Ms. Barragan, pursuant to H.R. 8, I inform the House that Mr. Barragan will vote yes on the motion to table. As the member designated by Mr. Liu, pursuant to H.R. 8, I inform the House that Mr. Liu will vote yes on the motion to table. As the member designated by Mr. Lowenthal, pursuant to H.R. 8, I inform the House that Mr. Lowenthal will vote yes on the motion to table.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Massachusetts seek recognition?
Good morning, Mr. Speaker. As a member designated by the Honorable Ms. Lori Trahan of Massachusetts and pursuant to House Resolution 8, I'd like to inform the House that Ms. Trahan will vote yes on the motion to table, the motion to reconsider. And as the member designated by the Honorable Mr. James Langevin of Rhode Island, pursuant to House Resolution 8, I'd like to inform the House that Mr. Langevin will also vote yes on the motion to table the motion to reconsider. Thank you.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Connecticut seek recognition?
As the member designated by Ms. Wilson pursuant to H-Res 8, I inform the House that Ms. Wilson will vote yes on the motion to table.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as the member designated by Ms. Leger Fernandez pursuant to H-Res 8, I inform the House that Ms. Leger Fernandez will vote yes on the motion to table.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Massachusetts seek recognition?
As the member designated by Ms. Mang pursuant to H-Res 8, I inform the House that Ms. Mang will vote yes on the motion to table.
For what purpose does the gentleman from South Carolina seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as a member designated by Mr. Wilson of South Carolina pursuant to H-Res 8, I inform the House that Mr. Wilson will vote aye on the motion to table. As a member designated by Mr. Gonzalez of Ohio pursuant to H-Res 8, I inform the House that Mr. Gonzalez will vote aye on the motion to table.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Pennsylvania seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as a member designated by Mr. Lawson of Florida pursuant to House Resolution 8, I inform the House that Mr. Lawson will vote yes on table motion of reconsideration.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Illinois seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as the member designated by Mr. Grijalva pursuant to H-Res 8, I inform the House that Mr. Grijalva will vote aye on the motion to table.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Pennsylvania seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as a member designated by Mr. Doyle of Pennsylvania pursuant to H-Res 8, I hereby inform the House that Mr. Doyle will vote yes on the motion to table.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Arizona seek recognition?
As a member designated by Ms. Kirkpatrick pursuant to H-Res 8, I inform the House that Ms. Kirkpatrick will vote yes on the motion to table.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Maryland seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I'm the member designated by Mr. Ruppersberger pursuant to House Resolution 8, and I inform the House that Mr. Ruppersberger votes aye on the motion to table.
For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as member designated by Congressmember Costa pursuant to House Resolution 8, I inform the House that Congressmember Costa will vote yes on the motion to table. And Mr. Speaker, as member designated by Congressmember Napolitano pursuant to House Resolution 8, I inform the House that Congressmember Napolitano will also vote yes on the motion to table.
For what purpose does the gentleman from New York seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as a member designated by Ms. Stefanik pursuant to H-Res 8, I inform the House that, in fact, Ms. Stefanik will vote no on the motion to table.
What purpose does the gentleman from New Jersey seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as the member designated by Ms. Bonnie Watson Coleman pursuant to H-Res 8, I inform the House that Ms. Watson Coleman will vote